The future is here already. It's just not evenly distributed. Yet. Today's world teems with innovation. The nexus of hardware, software, and human ingenuity promises a revolution in possibilities. What does tomorrow look like? Witness Future Proof.
Ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome back to another episode of Future Proof. And folks, I am so excited today to have Justin Reock, Chief Architect for Perforce, on the call because he's going to go into great detail about licensing, but also about history. So we're going to tie ancient history to modern times quite cohesively. And I love this. We're going to talk about DRM, digital rights management, but also the licensing, GPL, GNU, et cetera, for software and for free software. And in general, the theme here is you don't want to quarantine knowledge. And with that, Justin, take it away.
Thanks, Eric. That's perfect. I love that statement because I think it provides a really, really good visual for a lot of the themes that we're going to talk about today. So this quote that you see in front of you is you've probably read it before. A lot of people have read this or they've seen some version of it. But it's one of the guiding principles of the Free Software Foundation. And it says that free software is a matter of liberty and not price. And to understand this concept, we should think of free as in free speech, not as in free beer, okay? In other words, what are we free to do with this software? What are we free to build with this software? What are we free to learn from this software? And by the way, we probably won't be paying for the software either. So these guiding principles kind of formulate this difference between what we would call open source software and free software. Again, back to the free as in free speech versus free beer. A lot of times, there's not a lot of discussion about these distinctions. Okay, so we kind of think of all open source software as being in the same category, but that's not really true. There are licenses and there are software communities who have a philosophy around software freedom, and they call their software free. And generally that software is included as part of open source software, which follows that definition that the source code is available, transparent, available to everybody. But the philosophies are a little bit different. The Free Software Foundation follows a guiding principle that software has the capacity to make the world a better place through guiding us through innovation, through allowing us to accelerate ideas and allowing us to equalize the playing field for people to be able to manifest their ideas, and to be able to have a certain amount of freedom in that development and in that building is what we would call an ideal, right? That sounds pretty idealistic to say everyone should just have free software and have access to the same software and have access to the same infrastructure so that we can make the world a better place, right? It's very easy to say and very easy for, I think, a lot of people to exclaim. What the Free Software Foundation does is they take that notion to the next step. They enact what they call pragmatic idealism. So idealism is let's make the world a better place through free software, not free from cost, but free in that anybody who wants it can get it, look at the source code, learn from it, change it, whatever. But let's insert some pragmatism. Let's actually have a path to getting this free software in the hands of everybody. And that is where the Free Software Foundation comes in. That's really their mission. It's the ability to have things like the GPL license, which we'll be talking about shortly, have mechanisms that make sure that free software is always available to people who want to learn from it, and that people who benefit from it and make it better are obligated to share those benefits back with the broader community. So it's easy to say that free software for anyone can make the world a better place, could be written off as idealism. But the people who are part of this foundation are smarter than that. They understand that there needs to be a pragmatism involved here too. And that is really, I think, the central mission of the Free Software Foundation. So you can almost think of it, and it has been thought of, as a social movement in software. as opposed to just a methodology of building software that we see with open source. And so to kind of dig in a little bit deeper, part of the Free Software Foundation's published manifesto, why open source misses the point of free software, is that in their case, they say when we call software free, we mean that it respects the user's essential freedoms. There is a depth to this statement that's not immediately evident. We have software that respects the user's freedoms, not the other way around. The software doesn't direct what the user is allowed to do with the hardware. The software does not tell the user that it can or cannot have access to the source code. We can extend this idea and extrapolate it in some cyberpunk dystopian directions if we want to. I think it's fair to go through that mental exercise. I think it's fair to say that we should start from a foundation of software, knowing what we know about AI and predictive analytics today, that we don't want to start becoming comfortable with development patterns that take away the control that users have over the software that they're using, okay? So where the Free Software Foundation says that open source misses the point, it's not a dig. It's not saying that open source is bad. It's not bad, all right? Open source is great, okay? But when we say free software has a different purpose and a different mission, I think that's also a fair statement, all right? And so it's a difference in philosophy, right? In 1998, there was sort of a splinter group from the Free Software Foundation, folks who were involved in the GNU communities and stuff, who started campaigning in the name of what we call open source software. This idea of open source started becoming sort of interchangeable. To the Free Software Foundation's credit, it irked them a little bit, because we don't want people thinking that free software, potentially software capable of enacting social change, is really just about making sure everybody can get a free messaging solution. So they're really solving different problems, okay? The goal of open source is to create great software. The goal of the Free Software Foundation is absolutely to make the world a better place through free software, okay? And it does that. Part of that pragmatic idealism is that it establishes a software license called the GPL, or the GNU Public License. And it basically means that any freedoms that are enjoyed by some user of GPL protected software has to extend those freedoms to another user. Okay, that's really the core and the intent of the license. If you're enjoying something that this freedom is getting you, right, then you have an obligation to give that back. So if I distribute or if I modify some piece of GPL software, I can do that all day long. I can even charge for it if I want to. I can, as you know, Red Hat, for instance, is an example of a company that did that way back in the day. They took GPL software, they charged for the means of distribution of that software, i.e. a software, literally a physical catalog when they first started, and they were charging for the distribution of GPL software. But if they ever modified that code or improved that code, they were bound by the terms, they're still bound by the terms of the GPL to give that code back. I think one of the most stark examples, really, I guess, the most obvious examples maybe, is the fact that CentOS, the CentOS operating system, exists alongside Red Hat Enterprise Linux and is binary bit for bit compatible, the exact same operating system in every way, down to the kernel, except for branding, except for the Red Hat logo, and except for its connection out to the Red Hat Enterprise server. Other than that, it is by the terms of the GPL necessarily exactly the same, because Red Hat Inc. can be sued by anybody who's ever made contributions to the GPL and abided by those terms if Red Hat doesn't abide by those terms. So the GPL is very important. It makes sure that the founding freedom, philosophies of freedom associated with free software are maintained in a legal way. So why would we maybe not use a GPL license? Because permissive licenses can be a little bit problematic. Okay, so when we say permissive, really what we mean is if you modify that software, you have to give that software back to the community, including the improvements that you might make to that software. And that's not fair. You've done something to improve it. Everyone else deserves to benefit just like you did. Nothing forces developers in this case to give back what they've modified. So there's just too much room here for proprietary ownership. That might be good for a single company. The benefit that they get from being involved in an open source community is totally outweighs the risk that they might share some improvement they made to an open source library with their competitor, right? The fact that their competitor can benefit from their improvement to that software is less of a problem than the gain that company gets intellectually and academically by being culturally involved with open source communities. But listen, in the end, it's all good, all right? Free is different than open. Open source software is about making great software and making it in a community way, a crowdsourced way, where you don't necessarily have to pay for it, right? The goals are different, but the impact is the same here, right? By fostering and encouraging free development, we create shared communities around development. And by keeping that creativity open, we increase the collective creativity of the world around us. By creating software communities, we accelerate human innovation. Okay, and I think we've seen through open development that really take place. We can go back to the earliest piece of free software developed, 1976, Emacs, still in use today, text editor. And we can see how the Free Software Foundation 6 years later is formed. So 1983, gosh, I was off. I was wrong. I thought it was earlier than that. But then, of course, the GCC toolset, which everybody's familiar with GCC, even if you don't think you are. If you've ever compiled a C program from source, if you've run make on the command line, you're using and most likely if you're doing that in Linux, you're using the GCC client libraries for C++. These are just utilities that help you do things like build C libraries, which helped build Perl, right? And then bring more open source programming to lots of people. Perl was huge, right? All of a sudden, this giant impact that would lead us to, way forward impact that we see with something like Node.js now. These massive, like free, powerful programming languages with these huge developer contributed libraries of modules that allow you to do incredible things without having to pay for expensive compilers or having lots of crazy resource just to learn how to do this stuff, right? Anybody who wants to has all the resources they need to learn and to contribute and to make the world better if they want to. But it wasn't always this way. There are trademark problems of not having this type of openness in the way that we think about knowledge. And to borrow another Cory Doctorow's ideas, we can look at alchemy as sort of early closed development, right? Alchemy is not given really the credit that it deserves in some cases, oftentimes because we can't give it any credit because we don't know what people were doing because it was kept completely secret. But we do know that there were some advancements made. There was also a lot of loss of life because people drank things like mercury and arsenic as they were kind of in their search for an elixir of life. But if you take this in this kind of knowledge, this tinkering with chemicals and whatnot in the context of its time, and if you then think about it as people looking at this as very esoteric wisdom or kind of the new thinking way of the time, the fact that this stuff was done in secret was just problematic, right? Again, let alone alchemists drinking poison, but moreover, if any of these folks could have shared their discoveries with one another instead of keeping them in their secret journals or whatnot, can you imagine how much faster we might have accelerated chemical engineering and how fast we might have gotten through some of the dark ages and periods of history that were not so great when the great thinkers of our time were not collaborating. There's an even more ancient example of this problem of secret knowledge in a guy that I think a lot of us are familiar with, Pythagoras, or at least we're familiar with this from probably middle school algebra, the Pythagorean theorem. Lets us calculate the hypotenuse of a right triangle. We're pretty sure that Pythagoras actually invented this theorem. We can't really know for sure, again, because all of his work was also done in secret and considered to be very esoteric, hidden knowledge. Now, again, if you put this in the context of its time, it kind of makes sense. the ancient Greeks were doing amazing things with geometry. They were doing amazing things with math. They were building structures that had never been built before. They were creating civic infrastructure that had never been created before, right? In many ways, the guarded knowledge of sacred geometry at the time and esoteric knowledge is a lot like code knowledge now. A physical infrastructure was being built back then, whereas a digital infrastructure is being built now. And Pythagoras had a very different worldview on math, and so did the world at the time. You know, we look at math as something, of course, if you think about it, and if you think about any sufficiently advanced technology looking like magic, you can think about math as a language of the universe that allows us to do amazing things like create computers and whatnot. But we have, I think, a more scientific, less metaphysical view of that. The Greeks absolutely did not. They looked at math and music as all interchangeable. They thought about this knowledge as divine, right? Knowledge that was given to us directly from celestial beings in the sky. Okay, so what I mean by that is that the knowledge that Pythagoras had and kept secret would have been considered very highly desired, and he structured his school in a inner circle manner. So there were two layers to the Pythagorean school: the outer layer, or the acousmatics, or the listeners, and then the inner circle, the mathematicoi, or the learners. The acousmatics were kind of like servants to the school, and they didn't really get a chance to learn about any of the deeper algebra and geometry that was being invented at the time. And there was one very particular member of society in the city of what was called Crotone at the time, which is in southern Italy now, modern southern Italy. But this is where Pythagoras had his school. There was a nobleman there named Cylon, not that Cylon, the real Cylon, who was a leading citizen of Crotone, and he wanted very much to be part of this inner circle. And being a nobleman, he thought that it was just his birthright, right? I mean, the idea of nobility given to you, your station given to you by the gods, he thought that he just belonged in the school as a result of this. And he was refused over and over by Pythagoras, and ultimately that did lead to Cylon revolting against the entire Pythagorean school. In around 509 BC, most of the students were killed, and Pythagoras died alone in exile, all because he didn't want to share that sacred geometry, that knowledge that really, what was it being used for? It wasn't magic, right? It was building, right? It was building temples and buildings and sewers and cisterns and things that, you know, could be used to build a new society. Nothing magical going on there, and certainly an argument that it shouldn't have been kept hidden. But we didn't always, thankfully, continue to believe in nobility and birthright, and we didn't continue to believe in secrecy and hiding knowledge. And we did kind of find a light in all of this superstition and secrecy during a very important period of human history called the Age of Enlightenment. And you know, the Age of Enlightenment is when we kind of pulled ourselves out of a lot of this belief in secret knowledge and superstition, and moreover, that divinity and birthright and nobility were responsible for thought, right? That at the time, again, very hard for us to conceive, but if the king thought of something, that was an idea that came from God, and that was what was going to happen. So your own reason as an individual didn't matter. If you weren't born into nobility, God wasn't speaking through you, and so you had no real purpose. Okay, so the power of this statement by Immanuel Kant, it seems easy for us to read this and be like, well, of course I'm going to use my own reason. This was outrightly in defiance of that way of thinking. Dare to know. Dare to defy the power structure. Dare to defy the authority that tells us that noble birthright are the only people capable of having important ideas. But these things that happen should sound very familiar to anybody who's familiar with open source and open source communities and what we're doing around innovation now, the sharing of ideas through publication, the rise of the public sphere, the importance of individual liberty and the creative freedom of an individual as opposed to birthright or nobility, and the formation of the scientific method and reductionism. Isaac Newton made contributions at this time, but he published those contributions. So unlike your alchemist who's keeping all of these things secret. Isaac Newton published his Principia Mathematica, and suddenly mathematicians across the world have a central source of knowledge that they can all standardize on. And now all mathematicians who have read this book are allowed to start thinking in the same direction because they're collaborating instead of sharing or keeping their ideas secret. Another influential guy was John Locke at this time, not that one for our lost fans. This was real John Locke who wrote the essay concerning human understanding. And in this essay, he says that every human, this is very important, every human is a tabula rasa, or a blank slate. So whereas birthright says that if you're born into nobility, God has gifted your brain with something at birth that gives your ideas more importance than everyone else's, almost like a lithography. John Locke says, no, screw that. Everybody's born a blank slate with an individual capability for anything, for any type of thought, right? And he would define then the idea of an inalienable right, right? So because of the importance of the individual, then every individual has an inalienable right, which would form the basis of our US Declaration of Independence. He did a bunch of other stuff too, like he helped propose an economic system that should sound a little familiar, lawmakers, and then the enforcers of that laws are supposed to be separate entities. He just kind of felt like you can't create the laws and also enforce the laws at the same time. He thought somebody might become kind of mad with power. And so you see these, right. And so we see openness, we see individual freedom, we see meritocracy, and we even see many eyes here, the Linus Torvalds many eyes theory about software security. So, you know, larger things that we see emerging now in the public sphere, we see the rise of the Florentine bodega, right? These communities where artists and poets and crafts people could come together, and engineers to form these enlightened communities all working together. And Leonardo da Vinci came out of one of the Florentine bodegas, right? I mean, they gave birth to these geniuses, which reminds me of GitHub, frankly. You know, I think if we put it in a modern context, I think Git and a Florentine bodega are actually pretty similar. And I think a Parisian salon as well, again, where people from all walks of life are going to come together and share meaningful discourse. We've seen the opposite happen too. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but we know with closed development that sometimes we may have smaller problems, just difficulties, slowness in being able to get through our processes and push our software out. We can't grow to the degree we want to if we're always beholden to some owner. We can't modify feature sets. We have to just kind of, you know, accept what we get. And we don't then have the ability to really learn from and improve upon the works of others. Less oversight leads to less security. And there's a really good example of, I think, in the software world. Can you imagine, for instance, this is a part of the TCP protocol handshake. Could you imagine if the TCP protocol, you know, the guiding communications protocol for the internet, were a closed or proprietary protocol? I mean, it's a necessarily open protocol, right? And because of that, we all have a a decentralized internet where Charter doesn't have one protocol that Verizon has to pay tariffs on if they want to get information from Charter's network, right? We don't have that because we don't have closed proprietary communication protocols on the internet. We have an open internet, and that's the difference. Things can get a lot worse if we keep things secret. Some people might be familiar with the Green Run experiments in which women and babies were exposed to iodine-131 as part of a purpose to try to figure out en masse as what happened to people if they were exposed to radiation. The Atomic Energy Commission contaminated a 2,000 square kilometer area with iodine-131. They did it again in 1962, by the way. It continued. We had fallout research in Nevada up to 212,000 excess cases of thyroid cancer. So given the modern context, let's call that more than twice as many people currently affected by our modern crisis right now. In these fallout research experiments. Holmesburg prison, injection of dioxin, the MK Ultra experiments. Everyone should look at what happened at this point in time and be thoughtful and critical about what happened. But at the time, we weren't allowed to be thoughtful and critical about these things because they weren't being done openly. We have a current controversy that protects this closedness of software, which is so fundamentally important to the modern infrastructure that we're building. And that is DMCA 1201, which makes it a felony to break a software company's digital rights management software. So now if somebody takes a piece of open source software and sticks it behind a DRM protected gate and tries to subvert that DRM by taking advantage of just a software vulnerability, right? We're not talking about physically breaking property here. We're talking about discovering a vulnerability in a piece of software and using that software in a way that it wasn't originally intended. Section 1201 of the DMCA makes that a felony. Now, some exemptions have been granted for security researchers after a team of researchers at Johns Hopkins University did circumvent Ford and Toyota's in-dash entertainment system DRM for their cars and found a number of important vulnerabilities, some of which could have led to things like disabling the anti-lock brake systems in cars remotely. And rather than being treated as the research heroes and thought leaders that they were instead threatened with DRM protections, with DMCA violation, and threatened to be thrown in jail as felons. Okay, I think we can do better than that for the people who are just trying to put some visibility and oversight into the software that is continuing to build our world. So I'd say in the end, be open. I think the biggest problems of our day are not going to be delivered anymore by one entity, a lone genius in an ivory tower, right? I think the biggest problems of now and our future are going to be solved by open communities working together. And by being involved in open source, by tuning in and looking at this, you're already participating in the free software movement. And it really is a huge world. And I can't wait to see what everyone does with it. So I just say go forth and make awesome things.
I wanted to just discuss a couple of these things with you, and maybe we'll get you obviously on another show. But, you know, medical research today, it was, I guess this is probably 5 years ago or so, I was working with a guy who here in New Orleans was trying to create an entity around medical research that would be similar to something we worked with together called the Downtown Development District, which is a really cool thing. So in New Orleans, there's the DDD, as they call it, and it's basically what in the North they call a TIF, a tax increment finance district. And what you do is you select an area, a downtown that you want to rejuvenate and improve, and you assess a millage basically on the property tax values, and that millage goes into the DDD. He wanted to do something for medical research. He said the problem with medical research is people keep it to themselves because they want to get their grant. They don't want anyone else to know what they're working on. So it's all about them getting a grant, right? If you think about it, if there's any space where you want to collaborate on research, it would be the field of medicine, but it's not. And there are several other things that you mentioned that I thought were
I mean, and you know, medicine is one that is bothersome, right? Because again, it's you can see both sides of the argument, right? Yeah, it does come back to grant research. It does come back to, you know, making sure that you can pay smart people to work on this stuff, most of whom really are in it for the work, right? But I mean, again, we have a system now that we've created, something that can improve humankind, but we've decided somehow, we've all agreed that it's okay for an organization to keep that secret, be the only one who figures out how to profit off of it. You know, there's, and I mean, look, I mean, obviously this is a much bigger, broader philosophical discussion, and I'm not a naive person who hasn't thought about several different avenues on this one. But when it does come to things that improve the station of humankind, I feel like we've been able to devise ways to make sure everybody gets paid and still kept things non-zero sum. You know, I think as humans, we can figure out a way to make sure we get paid and we still benefit all of humanity.
So, dude, you're a baller. I love it.
Oh man, I love it too. Thank you. Thank you for thank you for the platform and for the discussion. And I'm happy to talk about this whenever, man. You know it. So.
All right. Well, let's keep the party going, man. I'll have a great weekend. I'll talk to you soon.
You too, man. Take care. Thank you. I'll talk to you later.
Later.